What would you think if a man who despised faith, who saw prayer as the last refuge of the desperate and deluded, became the center of a miracle? This is the story of Arthur Vance, a man whose heart was a fortress of logic and grief, and how the theft of a simple plaster statue shattered its walls forever. It began not with a bang, but with a quiet, simmering rage that had poisoned his life for years. Arthur Vance lived in a house of ghosts, not the spectral kind that rattled chains, but the silent, dusty kind that lived in the margins of old books and the faint scent of lavender that still clung to his late wife's armchair. He was a retired history professor, a man who had built his life on the solid bedrock of verifiable facts and empirical evidence. Faith, to him, was a beautiful, dangerous lie told to frighten children in the dark. His town, Havenwood, seemed to be slowly fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The clapboard houses sagged a little, the paint peeling in silent surrender to the seasons. The heart of the town, St. Jude's Catholic Church, was the most tired of all. It was a monument to a faith that Arthur believed was as weathered and worn as its stone facade. Its bell had not rung in a decade. His wife, Eleanor, had believed. Her faith had been simple and profound, a quiet light in her eyes that he had both loved and resented. When she got sick, she prayed. He researched, consulted specialists, and raged at the cold indifference of biology. In the end, her prayers and his facts had yielded the same result. She was gone, and the silence she left behind was a constant, ringing accusation. Now, he saw her simple faith as a betrayal. It had given her comfort, yes, but it was a comfort he saw as a delusion, a failure to face the stark, empty truth of existence. He guarded his grief jealously, nurturing it with skepticism and intellectual pride. The object of his particular scorn was a life-size statue of the Virgin Mary, tucked away in a neglected grotto on the church grounds. Its blue robes were faded, its plaster skin chipped, and stained by years of rain and moss. To Arthur, it was the perfect symbol of Havenwood's decay, a hollow idol for a hollow hope. Only one person seemed to care for the statue. Maria, a woman whose face was a roadmap of 80 years of hardship and prayer, tended to the grotto. She would pull weeds, her back bent, and whisper to the statue as if it were a living confidant. Arthur would watch from his study window, a bitter smile twisting his lips. He saw not piety, but foolishness. Then, a quiet fear fell over Havenwood. It was a sickness, a strange lethargy that settled upon the town's children. It started with a cough, then a fever that doctors could not explain and medicines could not break. One by one, the small, bright lights of the community began to dim. The sickest of them was Maria's granddaughter, Lily, a wisp of a girl with eyes the color of the summer sky, now clouded with an unshakable fever. The hospital in the next county was mystified. Whispers turned to panicked murmurs. The town felt cursed. In her desperation, Maria did the only thing she knew how to do. She gathered a small, desperate flock of mothers and grandmothers at the grotto. They knelt on the damp earth before the chipped statue, their rosary beads clicking like the frantic heartbeats of frightened birds. They prayed for a miracle. Arthur watched the vigil from his window, and the sight ignited a cold fire within him. It was an affront to reason, an insult to the memory of his wife who had prayed for her own miracle and received only silence. This public performance of baseless hope was more than he could bear. An idea, sharp and cruel, formed in his mind. It was an act of protest, a lesson in reality. He would take their idol. He would steal their plaster Mary and prove to them that she was nothing. He would force them to see that the universe did not answer the pleas of the desperate, that they were utterly and completely alone. That night, a storm rolled into Havenwood, a perfect accomplice. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and rain fell in thick, obscuring sheets. Dressed in dark clothes, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest, Arthur crossed the lawn to the grotto. The statue was heavier than he expected. He grunted with the effort, the cold, wet plaster slick against his hands. As he wrestled it onto a wheelbarrow, he felt a moment of absurdity, a flash of self-mockery. A professor of history, a man of letters, stealing a garden statue in the middle of a storm. But the feeling was quickly replaced by a grim sense of purpose. He wheeled it back to his house, to the workshop at the back of his property, a place filled with forgotten projects and the smell of sawdust and rust. He covered the statue with a dusty canvas tarp, hiding it away like a secret shame. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Let them pray to an empty pedestal. Let them face the silence. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. But a new storm was breaking in Havenwood. The news spread like a virus. The statue was gone. Outrage was quickly swallowed by despair. It was as if the last flickering candle of hope had been snuffed out. Maria was inconsolable, her face a mask of grief. Father Michael, the young, tired priest at St. Jude's, delivered a sermon that felt more like a eulogy for the town's spirit. He spoke of vandalism and disrespect, but his words lacked fire, laced with the same exhaustion that gripped his parishioners. Arthur observed it all from his self-imposed exile. He went about his day, reading, making tea, and pointedly ignoring the canvas-shrouded lump in his workshop. He had expected to feel vindicated, a sense of intellectual triumph. Instead, a strange and unwelcome emptiness began to seep into the cracks of his certainty. The silence in his home was no longer just the absence of Eleanor. It was something heavier, more profound. News came that Lily had taken a turn for the worse. The fever was consuming her. Arthur told himself it had nothing to do with him. It was a virus, a biological reality. A plaster statue had no bearing on the function of human cells. His logic was a shield, but it was beginning to feel thin, brittle. He started to feel watched. He would catch a movement in the corner of his eye or think he heard a floorboard creak upstairs. He dismissed it as an overactive imagination, the consequence of a guilty conscience, a concept he didn't even believe in. Then came the scent. He was in his workshop, staring at the shrouded form, when he first smelled it. It was faint, elusive, the scent of roses. It was impossible. His own garden was a tangle of weeds, and Eleanor's rose bushes had withered and died years ago. Yet the fragrance was undeniable, a sweet, spectral presence in the musty air. It was Eleanor's favorite scent. He threw open the workshop doors, gulping in the fresh air, trying to clear his head. It had to be a memory, a trick of the mind, his grief playing games with his senses. He was a rational man. He would not be undone by a phantom smell. But it persisted. Over the next 2 days, the scent of roses would come and go, a gentle ghost haunting the edges of his awareness. He began to feel a creeping dread, a sense that he had disturbed something more than just a piece of plaster. He found himself avoiding the workshop entirely. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he sat in his study, trying to lose himself in a book on the fall of the Roman Empire. But the words blurred. His mind was not on Roman aqueducts. It was on a little girl burning with fever. It was on an old woman's heartbroken face. It was on the scent of roses. A sound drifted through the open window. It was so soft he almost missed it. A woman weeping. He shot up from his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. He went to the window, scanning the overgrown yard. There was no one there. The sound faded, leaving only the chirping of crickets. He told himself it was the wind, a neighbor, anything but what his fracturing mind was suggesting. He was a man of facts. And the facts were these: a child was dying, a town was grieving, and he was responsible for a petty, cruel theft. There was nothing supernatural about it. That night, sleep did not come easily. He tossed and turned, the silence of the house pressing in on him. When he finally drifted off, it was into a sleep that offered no rest. He dreamed. He was not in some heavenly court or hellish landscape. He was in his own workshop. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in a single shaft of moonlight. And in the center of the room stood the statue, the canvas tarp pooled at its feet. But it was not a statue. It was a woman, cloaked in robes the color of the midnight sky. Her form was woven from soft, sorrowful light. He could see the grain of the wooden workbench through her translucent hands. Her face, beautiful and etched with an ancient sadness, was turned toward him. She did not speak. She simply wept. Her tears were not silver or gold, but tiny droplets of pure light that fell to the dusty floor and vanished. Arthur stood paralyzed, the intellectual armor he had worn his entire life melting away under the heat of this impossible vision. This was not a dream of his own making. It was an intrusion, a visitation. He felt no fear, only a profound, crushing sense of awe and shame. He understood, with a clarity that transcended language, that her tears were not for her own desecration. They were for him, for his bitter, lonely heart, for the town, for the little girl in the hospital bed. Her gaze met his, and in her eyes he saw not condemnation, but a mother's infinite, heartbreaking sorrow for a lost child. Then a thought bloomed in his mind, a voice that was not a voice, a message that entered his soul without passing through his ears. "My son waits for you," it said, a statement of both truth and invitation. "Do not let the children suffer for your pride." The dream dissolved. Arthur awoke with a violent gasp, sitting bolt upright in his bed. His pajamas were soaked with sweat, and his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The last vestiges of the dream clung to him, more real than the solid bed beneath him. And the room, his simple, familiar bedroom, was filled with the overwhelming, undeniable fragrance of fresh roses. It was real. The certainty of it crashed over him, wiping out a lifetime of skepticism in a single, terrifying, glorious wave. The arrogance that had been his shield and his prison for so long was gone, shattered into a million pieces. In its place was a raw, gaping wound of regret. He stumbled out of bed and through the dark house, his bare feet cold on the wooden floors. He didn't bother with a light. He knew the way to his workshop by heart. He threw open the door, and the scent of roses washed over him, thick and sacred. There it was, a plaster statue, covered in a dirty tarp. But he no longer saw plaster and paint. He saw the vessel. He saw the echo of the light he had witnessed in his dream. He ripped the canvas away and fell to his knees on the cold concrete floor. And Arthur Vance, the man of facts and reason, wept. He wept for his wife, whose simple faith he had scorned. He wept for his own pride, a fortress that had kept out not only pain, but grace. He wept for the heartbroken town and for the suffering of a child. His tears were a baptism in the dust of his own forgotten hopes. He didn't know the words to formal prayers. They had been erased by decades of disuse. So he spoke from the hollowed-out space inside him, his voice a raw whisper in the rose-scented dark. "Please," he choked out, his forehead pressed to the cold floor. "Please, don't let her suffer. Not for me. Please." It was the first true prayer of his life, a prayer of complete and utter surrender. As Arthur remained kneeling in the darkness of his workshop, a quiet shift was occurring across town. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit room of the county hospital, a nurse making her rounds noticed something. Lily, who had been lying still and pale for 2 days, her breathing shallow, was stirring. The nurse rushed to the bedside. The girl's eyes fluttered open. The feverish glaze was gone. Her eyes were clear, the color of a summer sky once more. She looked at the nurse and whispered a single word. "Thirsty." By dawn, a wave of inexplicable healing was sweeping through Havenwood. One by one, the sick children woke from their fevers. Doctors were baffled, calling it a spontaneous remission, a statistical anomaly. But the mothers and grandmothers of Havenwood knew better. They called it a miracle. In the first light of morning, Arthur felt a strength he hadn't possessed in years. He found clean cloths and a bucket of water. With the gentle reverence of a penitent, he began to clean the statue. He washed away the grime of his theft and the accumulated neglect of years. He discovered a small chip near the statue's praying hands, a wound he had inflicted in his haste. With painstaking care, he found plaster and tools in his workshop. His hands, once used to turning the brittle pages of history books, were now surprisingly steady as he repaired the damage. He didn't try to hide the repair, leaving a faint, pale scar, a testament to its brokenness and his. Under the cover of the pre-dawn quiet, he wheeled the statue back to the grotto. The effort strained his old muscles, but he felt no pain, only a quiet, urgent purpose. He settled her back onto the pedestal, positioning her just so, facing the rising sun. Maria was the first to see it. On her way to early mass, a habit she refused to break even in her grief, her path took her past the grotto. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw the statue, not just returned, but clean, cared for. The pale scar on its hand seemed to her not an imperfection, but a mark of grace. At that same moment, her phone rang. It was her son, his voice choked with emotion, telling her that Lily was awake and asking for breakfast. Maria fell to her knees, her tears no longer of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. The news spread. The town gathered at the grotto, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. They saw the returned statue. They heard the news of the children. Doubt melted away, replaced by a shared sense of wonder. Father Michael stood among them, his own tired skepticism giving way to a flicker of awe. He looked at the statue, then at the faces of his flock, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the presence of God not as a doctrine, but as a living reality. Arthur watched it all from his window. He did not join the crowd. This moment was not about him. It was about them. It was about a grace he had not earned, but had somehow received. Later that day, he found Maria alone in the grotto, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at the statue's feet. He approached her quietly. "I would like to help," he said, his voice soft, "to tend the garden here, if you will let me." Maria looked at him, her old eyes seeing not the town skeptic, but a man profoundly changed. She saw the dust on his trousers, the plaster under his fingernails. She understood, in the way of the wise, more than he could ever say. She simply nodded, a slow, gentle smile gracing her lips. "The Blessed Mother would like that," she said. Arthur's transformation was as quiet as his crime had been brazen. He did not make a public confession. His penance was service. He began attending Mass, always sitting in the back pew, an anonymous figure in the growing congregation. He and Maria worked side by side in the grotto, turning the neglected patch of weeds into a vibrant garden of roses and lilies. He told his full story only once, in the hushed confidentiality of the rectory, to Father Michael. The young priest listened, his own faith rekindled by the professor's quiet, astonishing testimony. The next Sunday, the church bell of St. Jude's, silent for a decade, was repaired. Its clear, hopeful peal rang out over a town that was no longer fading. Havenwood had been healed, in more ways than one. The statue remained in the grotto, a silent witness. The small, pale scar on its hand was never painted over. It served as a reminder that even things which are broken can be made whole again, that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the hope that blooms in its place, and that sometimes a man must be brought to his knees in a dusty workshop to finally learn how to stand in the light.